Got your cup of tea?
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah.
Excellent.
Are all those people behaving themselves?
It looks like it, yeah.
Yeah.
Some nice comments through.
Have we got any bad comments?
Yeah, but I've deleted those ones.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, we ready, and Richard?
Yeah, recording. Fire away.
Okay. Well, folks, hope you enjoyed the break. Feeding. It's feeding bees, this is. There's usually two reasons that it would be done, and two different times of the year. Either spring or summer to avoid starvation, and autumn winter to either replace or supplement their stores. So two rather different reasons. Now, what do you feed bees with? Well, I've always used what beekeepers have used for a long time, which is sugar syrup made up at home with the old measures of 2 pints of sugar to a pint of water, which if you shunt it on is these days a kilo of sugar, 625 millilitres of water, or probably more conveniently, 4 kilos of sugar to 2.5 litres of water. Now, you'll probably read about all sorts of variations on that. It doesn't matter too much. The more water you put in, the more the bees have got to drive off. The more sugar you put in, the more chance you've got of it not all dissolving. So that works pretty well to me. Nice and easy measurements. All I do is just simply put the water in the bucket and then sugar in, and give it a few stirs every time I go by. There are proprietary feeds. You can use them if you want to, but this is nice and easy, and it's absolutely no problem. Now, there are different types of feeders for different reasons. There are big feeders for commercial beekeepers, but personally, I like the smaller type of feeders for the ordinary beekeeper. So that's liquid feed. Candy and fondant can be fed. Now, candy is a bit of an old-fashioned word, really, because the older beekeepers used to make it themselves, and it was a bit like fudge. You either touched it with a knife and it shot people, or you poured it. So these days, if people use what one might term a sort of dryish feed, it's not syrup based. I tend to use the fondant that bakers use, baker's fondant, which comes in, I think it's 12.5 kilo blocks. Why 12.5 kilos, I don't know, but there it is. Anyway, can be fed on that, but I think it's a personal thing. Again, just have a chat with your tutor and see what they reckon. Please don't feed honey. For years and years and years, a lot of beekeepers have thought, oh, if I take my honey off, I can feed bees cheap imported honey, and they'll be okay. Well, that's the theory of that might be okay, but you run the risk of your own honey being contaminated with foreign honey for a start. It's now recognised that 40% of the honey on the world market is not honey at all. It's adulterated, or it's different different sugars, rice sugar or whatever. And the worst thing is that if it is honey based, it could carry bacteria, diseases that are notifiable here. We have a pretty good bee inspection service in this country. well, I know you folk might be coming from different places. England and Wales have got a pretty good bee inspection service. Outside that, Scotland and Ireland, you need to check locally. I don't think they're quite up to the same speed that England and Wales are. Right, so our level of disease is very low, but of course, if you buy honey that's come from a country that's where their inspection service isn't as good as ours, it runs a risk of infecting our own bees. And in fact, that happened last year. So it's still happening. Despite it was even warned when I started keeping bees, so nearly 60 years ago. So please don't feed honey. So what are we feeding? Well, this is one option. It's basically a little plastic bucket, usually a gallon, about a gallon, with a lid. It's got gauze in the, well, a hole in there, and then a gauze let in. So what you do is you fill the bucket up, put the lid on, turn it upside down, creates a vacuum, and then put it over the bees. And of course, as they suck it, air gets allowed up through. They're sort of okay. I don't like them as much as I used to, because what often happens is if you get the sun on it, it expands the syrup, and it just goes straight out into the hive, and of course you lose your syrup or lose some of it. So that's one. These are the ones I like. Now I think they're really good for the ordinary beekeeper with just a few colonies. They're 4.2 litres or whatever you want to call them. The little cover on the inside, that can be taken off and they can be stacked up because they're tapered slightly. So what happens is inside, you've got like a tube that's molded into the plastic feeder. So the bees come up into the tube, over the side, and then down the gap between the tube and the cover, and lick the syrup, take it back, and feed. So with this one here, if you would need to fill it up, you've got to take the bucket off, fill it up, and then put it back on again. So you need to smoke the bees, otherwise they'll come and give you some help. With this one, all you do is just take the lid off that's here, fill up the feeder, put the lid back, and you can do it in your underwear if you want to. It really doesn't matter. So what happens to bees in the winter then? And I wish some of our beekeepers, most of our beekeepers, would actually understand. Some of you may not even be able to remember scenes like this, but I'm old enough to. So what happens naturally, don't forget what I told you about the brood and the food above. In a hive, it's not quite so easy to do that. But look, the bees are good at, they're very adaptable, and look what they've done. The entrance is down there. So this is probably brood frame in November, or something like that. So they've got the food there, the brood there, food. The brood there. Been a long day for me. Easy for you folk. So there's the brood. The pollen, all the books will say the pollen goes above the brood. It does in a lot of instances, but some bees will put pollen underneath the brood as well, especially our native bees, Apis mellifera mellifera, or those with quite a high percentage of those genes. Normally, all the food will go, all the liquid food will go above that. So later in the season, give it another few weeks, this lot emerges, the weather gets colder, the bees contract into what's called a cluster. Some of them bury their heads in the vacant cells. If there is brood like this, they just pack in amongst the gaps between the combs. If the weather the colder the weather is, the tighter they cluster. The warmer the weather is, the more they break into a looser cluster. Now, in a natural situation, they've got a lot of food above them, so it's just munch, 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 and they can stay there for a month, 2 months, 3 months, or whatever, without any problems at all. As of course they do in colder areas, especially alpine areas, without any problems at all. But of course, we're restricted by this comb and anything that's stopping them above that. So the bees are forced to put their food at the side. That's no problem because they're reasonably adaptable. So they'll probably start by eating this way up here till they run out, and then they'll move sideways and then eat that. So that's where we need to understand what's happening in a natural colony so that we can sort of, well, try to replicate it where we can. And if we can't replicate it, we understand how the bees would respond. So for successful wintering, we need obviously bees and a good queen. So we try and keep the bees nice and strong, which in a natural situation they are. It's only when you get managed colonies or colonies managed by beekeepers that you end up with such problems. Make sure they've got a good queen. So if you see there's a problem with a brood laying or egg laying rather, anything like that, then you'll need to sort that out. But don't worry about that at the moment. That's something that you should get taught at your local beekeeping association. They clearly need food. Well, we've gone through that. If you give them enough food, they should be able to last the winter. Damp kills bees far more often than cold does. So they need to be quite dry. Therefore, they need some form of ventilation. And there's lots of arguments among beekeepers about ventilation who seem to think along human lines rather than bee lines. But let's not worry too much about that at the moment. All they need is a little bit of through air just to take away what damp air there is. And of course, make sure that the roof of the hive doesn't leak, all sorts of things like that. Oh, yeah, dry hive. I mentioned about earlier about make sure you haven't got a damp area so that you've got free flowing air around your hive, and that it's vermin free as well. There are a few things that will enjoy life around a beehive, and we'll discuss them in a minute, like now. So pests, the real pests that we get are probably mice, woodpeckers, and wasps. Now, I know if you come from some places, you won't get woodpeckers. And what I mean by woodpeckers is the green ones, the yaffles. The others don't touch beehives. Mice can be a problem. In fact, will be a problem if you allow them entrance. So you've got to cover them off somewhere. Wasps are getting much more of a problem. When I was young, if you saw wasps in December, that was early December, that was very rare because, of course, in them days, we had cold spells and frosts, sometimes 2-3 days, and they, of course, knocked the wasps out. I only heard a couple of weeks ago of worker wasps. Now, whether they're left over from last year or the new ones for this year, I don't know. But it was only something I was told, and it may well have been queen wasps. I don't know, but certainly wasps they're lasting now quite readily until the turn of the year. So they are a problem, and we beekeepers have got to deal with it. We're not going to spend too much time today on this, because it's something that you would need to do when you get involved. There are two moths, both called wax moths, greater and lesser, which can destroy combs. Again, I'm not going to go any further today, because you should really be taught these things at your local association. And quite frankly, I think beekeepers are the biggest pests to bees that there are, because some of the daft things that I see people do with no real thought, it seemed a good idea sort of thing, rather than trying to think things out, work out what the bees need, and try and satisfy them. So mouse guards, there's the entrance to the hive down there, and you can buy these mouse guards for less than £2, I think. All you do is just pin them on the front of the hive with a few drawing pins, and that stops the mice getting in. So both of those have been done. They're not my hives, they're somebody else's up in North Wales. Somebody mentioned woodpeckers. I saw this woodpecker go to the side of this hive in less than 5 minutes. It was just straight through, and that was it. Not my hives. I was actually out walking the dogs about half a mile away from where I live, I suppose. And somebody had decided they were going to start beekeeping, and bought a couple of hives, put them right by the footpath. We were walking along, and there it was. And it just went straight through. And I didn't know what it was hammering away at until I got right up close to it. So I couldn't chiv it away or anything like that. Yeah, why? Sorry. Why are they doing that? Well, of course, they usually do it only in the cold weather, when the ground is hard. So you get several days of really hard frost. The ground gets hard. They can't get their worms and vertebrates and all sorts of things that they normally would eat. So, of course, there's a nice box of insects there. Let's go for them. And that's why they go for beehives. Now, they can do quite a bit of damage, and it doesn't have to be in wooded areas too. I've seen them in gardens, and that's quite a small hole, that one is. I used to use this plastic membrane that builders use for putting under the concrete and floors. I've since discovered that what's called DPC, damp-proof course, which bricklayers use. There's one which I think is 225 millimeters wide, is just right for a national brood chamber. So just put it round like that, pin it with the straps, and if you get stuff delivered these days, they've got this strap. Excuse me. Just I use the strap so it doesn't tear the polythene. That's all. And what this does is it stops the bird clamping onto the side of the gripping onto the side of the hive. They can't do it, and they work a treat. You'll notice there the floor is not as wide as some of the others. You get wide floors and you get shallow floors. If you've got shallow floors, mice can't get in. So I don't need, that's one of my own designer floor. I don't need mouse guards. Now, disease is, I have to warn you that some people get absolutely paranoid about disease. There's no need to. No need to at all. There are a few problems. All you need is a little bit of knowledge, and know that they're split into two groups: adult bee disease and brood disease. Most of them are quite easy to see, to spot, and it's just a case of being vigilant. So let's just look at the adult bee diseases first. Recognition and understanding are important with all diseases, whatever. But good management and good husbandry will usually clear out any problems for them. I'm not going to go through in any detail because some of you won't even take up beekeeping, and I'll be wasting my time, and so will you. Then we get brood pests and diseases, of which there are a few fairly minor ones, common but fairly minor, not really doing much damage, not really killing the colony or anything like that. Nuisance value more than anything. But of course, you need a bit of knowledge. Now, we've got two established notifiable diseases. They've been here yonks, they really have. And they've been notifiable since, I think, about the 1930s. Both of them are uncommon, and these are the two bacterial diseases that I hinted about when I suggested that you didn't feed bees with imported honey. They're both uncommon, and that, of course, is a danger because the vast majority of beekeepers will never ever see them in a hive situation. So, of course, they're not looking for them. And then we've got two notifiable exotic pests. Both of them are so serious that they were made notifiable in 2006. And we think, or we hope, we still haven't got them. But if both of them are likely to come in on bees, and that's one of the reasons that we advise not to use imported bees. We do have a bee inspection service, which I've told you about. England and Wales is split up into 8 divisions. Each one has a what's called a regional bee inspector. So they are full-time, and under them they have seasonal bee inspectors who are part-timers. And it varies in numbers depending on the number of beekeepers in the area. And what they do is they just come around and inspect colonies every so often, and 80% of or it's reckoned that 80% of the notifiable diseases are found by the bee inspectors. But the key, as with anything, is to know what healthy brood looks like. If it doesn't look healthy, there's something wrong with it. Find out what it is, and that's the way I try to teach people, rather than just keep hammering away about disease when the vast majority of people, when beekeepers will never see it and won't even know what you're talking about. So this is a hint. This is just a little bit of brood, sealed brood in a comb. That's healthy sealed brood, is worker brood. If you see something like that or that, there's a problem. You might not know what it is. Just take a photograph of it or call somebody in, try and find out what it is, and it should help you with identification. Now, unsealed worker brood at this sort of stage, when it's filling the cell up, should look like that. And when I say should look like that, you see its segments. You see it's got a good shape, C shape, and it's this glistening white, which some people love to call pearly white. And I've got a saying, white, bright and curled up tight. And if it's not one of those, there's a little bit of a problem. Try and find out what it is. Now, if it happens to be like that, so that and that and that should look like that. If it doesn't, in this case, you've got a notifiable disease, and you need to call in the bee inspector. So just look at a comb. When it take it out of a colony, If it's got brood on a little bit of food, so this one's got everything. It's got sealed brood there, unsealed brood here, which is just about to get sealed. It's got pollen there, and there's usually no problem with pollen, and there's usually no problem with sealed honey either. So if it looks as good as that, okay, there are a few holes here, but nothing too much. All the brood looks good, absolutely fine, no trouble at all. But if it looks like some of the cells that I've shown you, then you need to find out what it is. You've probably all heard about Varroa. So some beekeepers, and some of them, I'm afraid, don't know very much about it. It parasitizes, well, it jumps species, we think, but we don't know. We think about 120, 140 years ago. Jumped species from another kind of honeybee out in the Far East. And of course, as so often happens, people move stock around, and of course, it's now worldwide, as well as jumping species. So the poor old bees, they get hammered because the brood gets parasitized, and so do the adults. Now, when it first arrived in 1992, it was probably the Varroa itself that was killing colonies. Now, I think because it vectors viruses, which were there in any case, but at very, very low levels, it vectors the viruses, and now I'm fairly certain it's the viruses that are killing the bees, killing the colonies, rather than the Varroa. It definitely does need understanding, but that's okay, because all you need to do is just understand what it's doing and the life cycle, and then any treatments or management techniques to try and reduce it, you'll understand what's trying to happen. Just zapping something with this, that, or something else, because it's that time of the year, or you were told to, or you read something online, isn't the best way of managing livestock in my view. And in fact, good stock people would tell you that as well. To keep right on top of it, you need to monitor it, which is no real problem. But that's beyond today's discussion. Going alongside the paranoia about disease, you'll also get people that tell you that you must disinfect everything between each hive, including your underwear. And quite frankly, folks, that is not really necessary. And very often you're told that it will stop you getting disease or prevent disease or whatever. It won't prevent it at all. At best, it will only slow it down. Why is that? Because diseases can be transferred by bees. So the chances of you getting a disease are going to be more is going to be greater by your bees going out, rubbing shoulders with infected material, which could well be robbing out a colony that's collapsing or has already collapsed, going and robbing the food out and bringing the disease back to your apiary. So that's one method of transfer, and of course the other one is the beekeepers not realizing that their bees are diseased, and then doing careless things like moving frames around between one colony and another. So apiary hygiene, although it will concentrate people's mind, I haven't got a problem with people disinfecting things if they want to, but it won't prevent things. It will just probably slow down any spread. The identification and understanding of diseases is very important in my view, not thinking that you just disinfect things and I haven't got to bother anymore. So you need to be sensible about it. That's all I'm going to say about that. So good beekeepers have, in my view, good powers of observation. They can see what's happening in a colony and what should know what should be happening. Lateral thinking as well, because you very often need to know what is going to happen in a colony in the future. So you should know a bit about development of the colony, and you need to be able to look and say, in 2 days, so and so is going to happen, or 3 days, or 5 days, or 9 days, or whatever. But that can be built up. The knowledge needed can be built up over the years. You need to be practical as well. There's quite a bit to do, mending, repairing things, making them in the first place. Most beekeepers assemble their own kit from flat packs. Some don't, and I understand there's getting a greater number who buy already made up, but it is more expensive, and you do need common sense too. Call it gumption if you like, but a lot of beekeeping, the thinking is done on the hoof based on your assessment of the situation. So observing bees, a colony of bees is telling you something all the time, even if it's just, we're all right, we don't need any help, we're doing fine, go and annoy another colony. Or it could be that perhaps they're running a little bit short of food, they need a bit more space, or perhaps one of the diseases that I told you about is a bit higher than it should be. So it's telling you something all the time. I showed earlier bees feeding each other. You see that regularly when you open a colony of bees. It's surprising the number of beekeepers that don't know what's happening. So look at the entrance before smoking, especially if you've got a couple of colonies of bees. If they're both behaving exactly the same, there's usually no problem. If one is behaving quite a bit differently than the other, sometimes you need to look in and find out why. And it could be that there's nothing wrong. It could be that they're being robbed out by another colony. It could be that it's sort of fairly early to mid-afternoon and there's a lot of activity outside one hive, and it could be something simple like the young bees are just taking flying lessons. So taking little orientation flights to so they recognise where home is, and there's absolutely nothing wrong at all. It just needs the beekeeper to have a little bit of knowledge and understanding. Have a look at the entrance and compare with other hives as well. So basically what I just said. Here's some simple things. I went to visit a beekeeper, saw the back of this. They hadn't seen it. That's the start of woodpecker damage. This is the front of one of my hives, a long time ago now, probably 15 years or so ago. And you can see a little bit of a problem out the front there. That's a fairly minor disease called chalk brood, which is a fungal disease, which a lot of colonies get, some more than others. Now, to a beginner, they might get all panicky about that. To an experienced beekeeper, you know what it is and try and treat it accordingly, or the colony accordingly. I won't say you need to keep records. It's a good idea to keep records because it doesn't make up for a bad memory. And the older I get, the more this seems to be a help to me. It should help you as well to make you decide when you need your next visit, because there's no point going and having a look at or inspecting a colony of bees in 2 days' time if you don't need to look at them for another 7 or 10 days, because, okay, it's good from a beginner's point of view. The more you can handle bees, the better. But from the bees' point of view, of course, every time you open a colony, you're putting stress into them. You put stress into them, it opens the colony up for disease and all sorts of things like that. Also, if you need to make a visit in 4 days' time, you know when to do it. Whereas if you leave it for 7 days, it could be too late. Also gives you a bit of an idea what you should expect next time too. So perhaps if you've got a young queen that isn't yet laying, you think to yourself, yeah, well, she's emerged. If the weather's good in the meantime, she should be laying in 7 days' time. She isn't laying in 7 days' time. You might think to yourself, she should have done. I wonder what's gone wrong here. Also, equipment. So perhaps if the bees are running a little bit short of space, you might want to take an extra super, or perhaps you think it's early in the season. I might need to put a super on them at the next time. Well, then you need to take queen excluder as well, and all sorts of things. This is never ever in books, but if you're ill for any reason, then if somebody can look at your records, they will know a little bit of the history of the colony. And you might think, well, I'm not going to be ill, but about 4 or 5 years ago now, I woke up one morning with abdominal pain. By about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd had my appendix out. So it can happen to anyone. Perhaps your colony characteristics. Perhaps you're interested in the sort of bees you keep, and you want to try and improve your bees and make sure they're much better and they're going to survive longer, and they're going to be healthier. All sorts of things like that. Perhaps just note down characteristics, or it could be something simple like they were really good tempered a day, or they were a bit on the touchy side. If you treat any food producing animal, forget quite the wording, but if you modify its health, or perhaps a technical term for it, with medication, you need to record that. Now there is a recognised form for it, but you've got to put down all sorts of things: the amount, the date, the amount you administered, the batch number, all sorts of things like that. And those records, even though bees don't live very long individually, those records you've got to keep for 5 years. That's a legal requirement. So what do you use? Well, probably in your early days, you'll use a little notebook or notepad or something of that nature, exercise book, something like that. And then you may progress on to your own record card or record sheet, something perhaps you design on a computer yourself, but based on what you actually want to record. Or you can go online and find various things on there. Some of them are very simple. Some of them are incredibly complicated. A lot of them in between, but tend to record some things that a lot of beekeepers just can't be bothered with. Mine are fairly simple sheets with only a few columns, mainly yes and no. I cross off the one that's inappropriate. One colony for a year on a sheet, in a plastic document wallet, in a clipboard like that, inside the hive. It's available, it's dry, and I can, every time I take the roof off, I can immediately see what I've got on my record sheet, and away I go. Saves time, nice and easy. So what sort of work have we got then from the beekeeper's point of view? Well, summer work, it clearly is the busiest time because that's really the active season, perhaps from back end of March right through to early November in most areas. We need to check for swarming, and the way we do that is check to see if there are any queen cells built, but I will be talking about the swarming process a little bit later. We may need to add supers. General colony management, all sorts of things that we need to do during the year. Now, the time taken for that for a beginner could be 30 to 45 minutes per colony, something like that, because they're going to be having a nose round to see what else they can find, which is absolutely fine. No problem with that at all. I wouldn't keep it open much longer than that, because every time you open a colony, you are putting it under a bit of stress, which might not do it any good. Now, for an experienced beekeeper, a reasonably experienced beekeeper, 10 minutes, quarter an hour per colony. Plus, of course, what you need to do is get your stuff out of your shed, get your smoker, a light, all sorts of things like that, which you've got to add on. Now, you can work on 7 or 14-day inspections. I'll explain why a little bit. Well, I hope I'm going to explain why a little bit later. If I don't, then ask me in question time. And any time in between that. So you can definitely do 7, you can definitely do 14. It depends on the way you manage your bees. Now, the great thing about those times is you can actually be a weekend beekeeper. And I go with Whisper Green to shows and those sort of things. And we have people come up wanting to know about beekeeping. And very often people say, I can't really keep bees because I work midweek and I've only got the weekends. Oh, yes, you can. You can keep bees very, very neatly. You may occasionally have something that needs doing during the week. Well, sometimes you can manage your way around that by some sort of technique. Or beekeepers are actually great people for helping each other out. So most things will probably be something fairly small, and we all tend to help each other. Most of us do anyway. So you'll find us a pretty good group. So beekeeping year then winter, December through to February, not much to do. Check occasionally for hive damage or interference. The sort of thing that can happen is perhaps a branch blow off a tree and damage a roof. Interference could be if you've got your bees at home. It could be something like a deer knock it over, because deer do knock beehives over, not deliberately, but they sort of scratch on the sharper corners, and of course knock things over. If you've got an out apiary, you'll obviously need to check things there to make sure that they're haven't been stolen or whatever. Check the stores, replenish if needed. And what you need to be aware of right at an early stage is there's a mentality these days of feed, and feed again. And if you're in any doubt, give them some more. That can do more harm than good, but overfeeding can do more harm than good. But I won't bother with that now, because a good beekeeping association should warn you about these sort of things. You can tidy the apiary up. Trim the hedge, make sure the ditches are cleared, and all sorts, fill in the rabbit holes, all sorts of things like that. You can prepare and repair equipment for the next year. Perhaps if you bought a bit more, needs to be made or whatever, and plan for the next season. You may have done something last season that you thought to yourself, I'll try and find an alternative for that. Perhaps do a bit of reading or a bit of thinking or a bit of chatting with somebody else, and work out what you're going to do for the next season. Varroa control, there's one technique that needs winter treatment when there's not much brood in the hive, because 80% of varroa are reckoned to be on the brood at any one time. If there's no brood in the hive, as there very often isn't during the certain parts of the winter, then's the time to treat varroa on the bees. But it's way beyond today's teaching, and of course learning as well. Perhaps reading a few of the better books, might be perhaps doing things online. There may well be a specialist course that interests you. There's all sorts of things to do rather than do what a lot of beekeepers do. As soon as the honey soup is off and the bees are fed, they forget them until the next year, and that's not really good beekeeping. So spring, March round to May, check stores regularly, because what's happening this time of the year is the queen is laying more and more eggs. Brood is very, very hungry. It really is. So the more brood, the more food they need, the quicker they run out of their stores. And certainly in March, we often get cold weather when the bees can't forage for much. So although the flowers are out, or plants are in flower, the bees can't really collect very much. So they're munching through their food like there's no tomorrow. In most areas, you should be okay for removing pest protection. If you're further north and it's colder, then perhaps leave it till April. And this is one of the reasons where I said I had an objection to beekeeping by numbers, because I'm telling the people further north to leave it later, because I know somebody who's writing about something when they're living in Somerset or Kent or Hampshire or whatever may not know how the weather affects the bees a lot further north. You can start inspecting colonies too. I checked some of mine on Tuesday. It was a fairly warm day, but that would have been Tuesday, about the 9th of March, something like that. Now it may well be that in Scotland, if that's where you come from, that you can't do it until mid-April. Spring cleaning is quite an important part of the spring work. All it is really is just get a clean hive, move your particular hive aside, put the clean hive on its place, and then just move the frames over, cleaning off any bits and pieces that you need to, like propolis and a bit of wax or whatever, and then move the bees in, close the hive down, and then you've got another hive that you can either clean for the next colony, or if it needs repair it. Adding supers, which is a good spring job. Won't talk too much about that now, but try and add them in advance to reduce swarming, or the possibility of swarming if you can. And regular inspections, certainly in my area, from early April onwards. Probably further north, mid-April, might even be towards the end of April. And then we need to try to prevent colonies swarming. Not every colony will swarm every year, but some of them do. So we need to be checked, and that's one of the reasons we do our regular inspections of either 7 or 14 days. So in the summer, June to August, regular inspections, again, 7-14 days or so. Keep the swarm prevention and control up. We add our supers. If we don't add supers, there's nowhere for the bees to put their surplus, and it also aggravates swarming. And then we remove the honey. Some of us have got early crops. If you're anywhere near oilseed rape, you're going to have an early crop. So you need to take that off because obviously granulates or crystallizes, whichever word you want to choose, and you can't extract it. And late crops, now some people get 2 late crops because if you're in a heather district, you may get flower crop or what I call flower crop, and you may get heather as well. Autumn, September to November, slowing down a bit. Keep up your regular inspections. Not for swarming at this time, but just make sure everything's okay. You've got the colony's got enough food and that sort of thing. If you control for varroa, and most people still do, then that will need to be done. Feeding. September in most areas is considered to be the month for feeding. If you take your bees to heather, you're in a heather district, then you've got to do it after that because, of course, August and September are heather months. And then preparing for winter, which is a lecture on its own, and I won't bore you with now, but, you know, putting on things like mouse guards is part of it, and other pest protection. Don't forget, you'll probably spend more time at meetings than you will on your own bees, and a bit of reading as well. So it's not just the 30 to 45 minutes that I told you about. It is going to be a bit more if you get involved. But if you're going to keep bees, you might as well do it. I won't quite say properly, but you might as well do it as best as you can. So what happens when bees swarm, which is the bit you've been waiting for, I'm sure. It is the only means the colony has got of reproducing itself. Just swarming, that's all, no more. So what happens is in normal circumstances, the old queen and some of the adults leave. They form the cluster. As soon as they've gone from the hive, that's it. They're on their own, and you've got two colonies. What they leave behind are some of the adults, some brood, some food, and developing queens. And of course, these developing queens will probably take over the colony eventually. Right. So what happens is they obviously need young queens, so they've got to have eggs in queen cells. So let's assume that this is the first egg to be laid in queen cell will be the first one at all the stages all the way through. That may not quite be the case because we are dealing with biology. So the queen starts laying eggs in queen cells, and others are laid over several days. So they are staggered. It can be as little as 2 days that I've seen, but more often 4, 5, 6, sometimes even 7 days. Now, after 3 days, let's assume it's that first egg hatches into a larva. After 8 to 9 days, I'd work on 8 rather than 9 that a lot of the books say, because we are dealing with biology and they can pinch a little bit sometimes. The first queen cell is sealed, so we're assuming it's the first egg that was laid 8 days ago. First queen cell is sealed. That is usually the trigger for the bees to swarm. So if everything's in the right condition, so the weather is fine, even though the first queen cell was sealed, let's say halfway through the night, the bees will wait till it's fine for them to go out. They will then swarm, and it really only takes less than 10 minutes for all the bees to go out the colony, usually. Right, they have gone. they are a new colony. What's left behind is the emerging brood, the adult bees, and all the virgin queens that are a result of the other eggs that are laid in other queen cells. Now there could be anywhere between perhaps 6 and 30. Right, they only need 1 or 2, but they usually lay a lot, or produce a lot more. So after 15 or perhaps 16 days, the first virgin queen emerges from the cell. That then can result in one of two things. Either she runs around, perhaps with the help of the workers, and kills her half-sisters or half-sisters in their cells, or she might go out with another small swarm called a cast, because don't forget, in the meantime, in the 7 days that since the swarm has probably gone, there's been quite a lot more young bees emerge, so it's bolstered the adult population. So she can go out with a smaller swarm called a cast, and then the next one to emerge would take over the colony. So that's basically what happens. It's a lot easier than I've explained it, but it doesn't change very much at all. And that's really what happens. And that's when we're looking at swarm control, what we're trying to do is disrupt what the bees are trying to do. That's all. So this is what's called a queen cup. You can see it's on the face of the comb. It could be anywhere, it could be around the edge. And it's as soon as you end up with an egg being laid in it, that's when you need to be aware the colony's looking to swarm. They're then fed on royal jelly, and you can just see the sea of the larva in there, surrounded by royal jelly. And somebody asked a question earlier what royal jelly is. That's where it comes from, queen cells. The cell wall is then extended, and the queen cell is sealed after 8 to 9 days, although that one is actually quite an older one than that, several days older than that, 3 or 4 days older than that, but let's not worry about that. And then the queen emerges from the end of the cell after 15 to 16 days. These are swarm cells on the face of a comb, and these are queen cell cups that the queen probably hasn't laid in. So that's the sort of thing you get. This is a swarm emerging from a colony, and even though I don't like it, there's still a little bit of excitement in an old man to see a colony swarm, and then take to the air, and then they settle somewhere. In this instance, they settled on a fence post, but mostly it's in trees, although they do pick on all sorts of things like bicycles and cars and all sorts of things like that. Now, beekeepers need to deal with it. It's a main summer problem, but as I've already said, not all colonies swarm every year. Unfortunately, it's often induced by the beekeeper either doing something daft or not doing something at all, which is probably more likely. So bees decide that they're going to swarm. Prevention and control are two different things. Prevention are the steps taken to try and discourage the bees from swarming in the first place. Control is what you do afterwards. We need to do it because it does cause nuisance to other people. If you're way out in the in a rural area, there's probably no and no problem whatsoever, apart from you losing half. Well, I won't say half, but some of your honey crop. But if you're in a relatively built-up area, it can cause a nuisance by colonies swarming in somebody else's garden, or taking up residence in their cavity wall or their chimney. It's a bit of a problem. Reduces honey crop. There's several methods of swarm control. All they're doing really is just disrupting the swarming process that I told you about. Beekeepers need to understand it. It's fairly easy to understand. If I can do it, anyone can do it. But sadly, some sort of think it's complicated or whatever. Now, depending on the methods that you choose to control your swarming and manage your bees, you can go 7 to 14 days between inspections that I've already mentioned, so you can be a weekend beekeeper. Taking the swarms nice and easy. This is one of our now ex-members. She's moved right away, Sigri. This was actually the very first time she handled bees. Her father kept bees for 40 years before he died. Her mother then took over, but she never got involved with the bees, and then all of a sudden decided to keep bees herself. Heard about this swarm. Well, she didn't hear about it. She saw it because she was a gardener, and this was one of the properties she was working on. Saw it there, phoned me up and said, "Oh, can you come and help me take a swarm?" Yes, of course I can. And there she is, with my one of my spare vials, absolutely fearless, taking a swarm. And that's how she started keeping bees. There's a swarm down there. And in fairness to Sigri, it was actually quite difficult because the bees just did not want to go into this here is called a skep. It's basically a straw beehive that beekeepers very often use for collecting swarms. I've got 3 or 4 of them, but you can also use anything, box, cardboard box, wooden box, or anything of that nature for collecting swarms. Having done that, take them home and just chuck them down in front of a hive on usually a sloping board. This was a fairly small swarm, otherwise I'd have put a cloth over the whole lot. And all they do is bees tend to walk uphill, straight up, in they go themselves. So they don't even need any help sometimes. It's nice and easy taking swarms. That's it, folks. Question time. Overrun this time, Richard. 2 minutes. Dear, oh dear, I'm getting worse.
I've been trying to answer a few questions at the same time to try and make sure everybody gets their questions answered. So let's have a look.
What you said, don't know to everyone, did you?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, ask somebody else.
Okay, yeah.
What do you mean by general colony management as apart from checking for swarming and disease?
Oh, there's all sorts of things that need doing. Adding supers, perhaps taking combs away from one colony that might have a lot of brooding and giving it to others that that are smaller colonies. There's all sorts of things like that that are going on during the summer. Okay, next one.
When you spot a queen cell, is it already too late to prevent swarming?
No. No, it isn't. That's what the swarm control techniques are designed to get over. Clipping the queen's wing so she can't fly is not a swarm control method. What it does, it delays losing a swarm for anything up to about 7 days. That is one thing that needs doing. So if you clip the queen's wing, the only way you're likely to lose a swarm is if one of the young virgin queens that are developing will emerge. So you make sure they don't emerge. I mean, very, very briefly, a typical thing is that a queen cell is sealed for 7 days. So if perhaps you're a weekend beekeeper and you make sure there are no sealed queen cells there, you know, let's say you do beekeeping on a Saturday morning, just for argument's sake, you know that next Saturday morning a swarm shouldn't have emerged. Okay, the queen might be fairly close to emerging, but the swarm shouldn't have come out of the. You shouldn't have lost the swarm.
Can you, is buying second-hand hives recommended?
Not by some people. I've bought ever so many second-hand hives over the years, and I've never had a problem. The problem, or the perceived problem, is that if they've had one of the two notifiable diseases, but it really is quite rare. What you could do is flame it out with a blow lamp. That's what most people do. It kills most of the bacteria or the spores. I think I'll be talking about buying equipment in the next session. But in the days before they sold the cheaper seconds, which aren't necessarily lower quality, but they're classed as seconds, which I'll talk about afterwards. It was attractive to buy second-hand equipment because the price was much lower. But these days, the seconds are so attractively priced that it's probably hardly worth buying second-hand equipment. It's okay if you're given it, but it really has got to be quite cheap, because it's not just the possibility, the outside, and I will say an outside possibility of disease. All sorts of things can happen. Somebody's had the best use out of it. It could be that it wasn't put together in the first place, especially if it was glued. That can be a problem. It could be that there's holes in it that need blocking up. If you need to do, let's take one of these brood chambers down here. They are, if they're premium quality, they're about £38 each, something like that. If they're second quality, they're about, I forget what they are now, 16, 17, £18 each. I'll talk about the various qualities. Now, at that point, it's probably better paying that money than it is paying £15, let's say, for something that's had 20 or 30 years worth of use out of it. It's got holes in it, and you run the outside risk, or run the risk of it being diseased. So it's now become less attractive to buy second-hand equipment. But of course, if somebody's giving up and they've got bees in it, in general, if there's bees in it, there's no real issue. It's when you get dead colonies or no live bees that really the problem is.
Glad you said that, because that nearly mirrors what I said. Just about poly. Obviously, you can't flame throw poly hives. I don't know if you know of any way of sterilizing poly hives, Roger.
Yeah, they what they do is usually they use bleach, or there's a product called Virkon, Virkon, which I believe they use in the dairy industry. It's a sort of stuff. It might be worth somebody looking at it, Googling it. Virkon. Having a look at it during the break. What you've got to do is get a bath or tray or something like that. Mix up the solution. Bleach is one of them, and then immerse, I think, for 20 minutes. But of course, because of the size of a box, a poly box, what they really do is just do one side and then turn it over, and then turn it over and turn it over. So you're spending the best part of 2 hours on each box disinfecting it. Unless somebody has discovered another way of doing it. I don't like discouraging things, but the more I see, the more I hear of poly, and speaking to beekeepers, certainly those who've kept them for 10 years, and they're getting to the point where they've got to chuck them away to buy new ones because they're worn out. You don't get that with wood. I think I mentioned earlier, some of my wooden ones are 60 years old. I know they're 60 years old, over 60 years old, because some of them, being local, there used to be a manufacturer in Crawley, CT Overton's, and they closed down in 1958 when Crawley Newtown was built. So I know that anything that's got CT Overton on, I know is at least 60 years old. And then that's if they were made in the last year, but probably they were made 10 years earlier. So some of them are old as I am. Anyway.
Daryl wants to know, is it fair to assume that you're still left with a viable colony after swarming?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what happens in nature. That is how bees expand. But it's you've got to sort of understand how nature works, because bees really, all they're trying to do is maintain a stable population. Because if they get too many bees, that then gets pressure on the forage, pressure on nesting sites, all sorts of things like that. If they haven't got enough, then all of a sudden they're having problems, things like inbreeding and all sorts of things like that, which come into it. So when they're expanding, really all they're doing is keeping the population stable. Okay, nature will say that the weaker ones will drop out, so they will govern the population anyway. Did that answer the question?
Yes, yeah, I think so.
I forgot what he asked. No?
Yeah.
Anyway, Karen.
A topical one, because some hives have been stolen quite recently. What's to stop somebody messing with your hives? For instance, taking the honey or stealing the hive?
It does happen, but I think there's a part of an answer these days is the wildlife cameras that are. If you look online, I don't know the quality, but I think you can get these for sort of under £50. Now, my guess is trail cameras, I think they call them. My guess is something somebody else can Google if they like in the break. My guess is because of what their intended use is, that they will actually stay outside almost maintenance free. Now, I think the trick will be to put perhaps 2 or 3 up, not just one, because if somebody is looking at interfering with hives, let's say, they might just have a bit of a look around. If they see one camera, they might cover it up or break it or something and think, oh, that's it. But if you're sharp enough and you've got another couple in the apiary, you'll be okay. Now, well, yeah, okay. It won't stop damage, it won't stop theft, but it might help catch people. Sorry, yeah, I'll better explain that. Yeah, what the old beekeepers used to do, or some of the old beekeepers used to do in areas of high theft, was they used to drill a hole in the base of the floor, the base of the floor, same size as a cork. And they get a flange cork and tie that to the hive stand. So of course people lift up the hive, walk away with it, and all of a sudden they get bees all over themselves and they drop it. That's I've never done that, but I've heard of it being done.
Can you start a colony in the winter months?
Not really, no. No, you can't really. I will be talking briefly about how to start a colony, but it's normally done in the summer, perhaps. Well, my area in West Sussex, from back end of April right through to perhaps mid-August, something like that. If you're further up country, Lake District or Northumberland or even Scotland, then you're probably looking early to mid-May through to the back end of July. I know somebody in North Wales, and he really can't start until the back end of May. He's up at, I forget what he's about 1,000 feet, I think. Of course, the problem is that you can't get queens mated early. That's his problem. But he is in a very marginal area anyway.
Lots and lots of very keen people out there, Roger, that are asking really advanced questions. So if they're asking about colony increase and things, so I've directed.
I'll be talking about that later. Yes. Richard, we only got another quarter now. If people want a break, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. I haven't got a problem with that.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. See you later.
$4 o'clock, Roger. I think it's 4 o'clock. We're coming back, everybody.